Welcome to your last panel session of Tuesday. We're very grateful you're here. My name is Soumya Korde, and this is the ROI in a Skills-First World panel. First, I really want to thank our organizers at ASU+GSV, as well as everyone from SHRM and Walmart for putting together this stage on skills-based talent practices. My name is Soumya Korde. I am a member of Grads of Life. We work with organizations, all types of employers that are implementing skills-first talent practices. My background is in workforce development and consulting, and I'm really grateful to be here today to facilitate this panel with our panelists. A little bit of framing before we get started. If you're here, you're probably somewhat familiar with skills-based talent practices. We know the data shows that there is a lot of momentum in this space. 4x the number of jobs have removed degree requirements in the last 10 years. About a dozen states have also adopted skills-based hiring, and about 3/4 of employers have said that they're also focused on this work. But I think, unfortunately, what we're seeing is we're not seeing kind of the same shift in employment practices to skills-based. We really want this to be the new paradigm. And today, we're not going to talk specifically about practices. We're going to talk about the return on investment of those practices. And at Grads of Life, we think about that in a few ways. We want to focus on what impact or ROI are we seeing for employees, what is the return for employers, as well as what's the return for society. And today we have an amazing panel that's going to share their vantage points as an employer, as technology solutions, and as a consulting organization in their work in supporting the implementation of skills-first practices, but really focused on the ROI or the return. And so our panel today is, to my immediate right, Heather King, the Vice President of Transformation and Enablement at Walmart. Then we have Parminder Jassal, who is the CEO of Unmudl Skills to Job Workplace. And then David Kafafian, the COO of Stride Funding, and Jay Puckett, the Managing Director and Senior Partner at BCG. Two things I actually want to say before we get into the questions is I am taking the place of my colleague, Elise, so apologies if I'm looking at my script here. So that's one thing. And then second, we would love to take some questions from the audience at the end, so would ask that you start thinking of the questions that you have for our great panelists as we get into this. So my first question is for you, Heather. So you work for Walmart, one of our largest employers. How do you think about the connection between skills-first practices and the bottom line? How has it evolved over time?
Yeah, great question. And I have to say, I would be remiss if I didn't start by saying we're very fortunate at Walmart in that our culture is very much about hiring and promoting for skills. 75% of our managers in our business started at the hourly level in our company. So it's something that, beginning with our founder, it was find the best talent, bring them in, give them the skills to grow within Walmart. What we are trying to do, though, is much more formalize that into our systems. So beyond the culture, how do we expand on that? So when I think about how do we measure it, some of the measures are what you would think of as typical HR measures. So we look at, what's the retention and what's the engagement of those that realize they have those greater opportunities, that upskilling is available to them within our company. How do we help them see that they can turn jobs into careers through skilling programs? And what's the result of that? We also very much look at, are they taking the opportunities? So through our Live Better You program, which offers either degrees or short form certifications to help upskill and move into higher paying jobs in most cases, are people actually taking that opportunity at what rate? And then how deep is our pipeline for the in-demand roles that we're trying to fill? So looking at those measures, very traditional kind of HR people, but they do have an ROI for the business in that we're trying to fill over 100,000 jobs over the next 3 years. And we want to do that primarily through our internal associates. So how are we building them up to fill those jobs? But if we take it one more step further, and I think this is the part that's really challenging for most companies, is we've been able to tie it directly to business results. So through our selection and upskilling training programs, what we know is that when our stores fully utilize those programs that are aligned to our skills philosophy, the top third of our stores that are utilizing those programs are outperforming on customer NPS by 23% over the bottom third of our stores that are not leveraging those to the same extent. So if you think about retail, it's all about customer NPS. That's what drives return customers, loyalty, and ultimately revenue share of wallet. And we're able to see how the programs, how we're approaching skills directly impacts that.
Thank you so much. And just to follow up there, so for the other 2/3 of stores, how are you now implementing the lessons that you've learned from that, kind of the stores that are really outperforming on the NPS scores?
It's been a many-year journey, particularly with the selection practices. That's been many years of convincing and selling. And then when they see, though, that bottom line result, when we can actually tie it back with data, then it's not the change management and push that it was maybe 3-4 years ago, right? Because they know it makes a difference for their business. Same thing with the upskilling training programs. They know that when we have higher completion rates, it's going to drive a different experience for their customers, because at the end of the day, the associates feel invested in, they feel seen for the skills that they bring and for what they can have in terms of a career. So they show up happier, and that passes on to the customers. So I think the results that we're able to show, tying it to the things that the business cares about, that's really going to gain its own momentum now.
Great, thank you. Okay, so moving on to Parminder and David. You both represent organizations that offer solutions and support to employers doing this work. Is ROI important when you're positioning your solutions to employers?
Hi, everyone. So first I'll just explain a little bit about why we work with employers. So Unmudl Skills to Jobs Marketplace, you might know the word unmuddle, like when something's muddled up. A lot of people say other words when they say something's muddled up. We unmuddle at Unmudl. And who do we unmuddle for? We unmuddle for employers, we unmuddle for community and technical colleges, as well as working learners. So Unmudl Skills to Jobs Marketplace is founded by America's community and technical colleges, specifically to build hands-on technician talent for employers. That's what we do. And in that, the focus that we have, the 100% focus, is on that technician level talent. So for that technician level talent, we ensure that the courses are directly, which we call skillware, is directly aligned to the job and job performance outcomes. And therefore, for the individual, for the working learner, those who are working and learning simultaneously, it makes it easy for them to get a return, because much less time invested, much less cost, looking at $2,000 or under in getting into a new career, as well as outcomes are more certain, whether it's credentials, credits, or getting interviews. So that's for the working learner ROI. For the community and technical colleges, it's very specific to enrollment ROI and other services. There's a lot of question out there, a lot of questioning by many audiences on whether college is worth it and whether any time should be spent there. So we work with the colleges, community and technical colleges, to redesign and reform the way that systems work in order to help working learners. Then lastly, getting to your question, the employer side of this. The ROI, essentially we have three, and David's gonna expand on this anyway. We have three major overall indicators that we work with employers on. One is business impact, just like Heather was talking here. Is the technician position going to cause a company to not be able to have a favorable earnings report because they can't staff up, can't ensure that operations are running? Or is the technician pipeline going to be so off that growth just cannot occur at a certain place? And the company won't do so well PR-wise in a community if they have to lay off a whole bunch of folks. So how can other employers pick up that same technician talent in that community? That's one, business impact. Second, overall indicator is time to fill. Time to fill meaning how long does it take to post a job regarding the skills that are needed, and then finally, how long does it take to hire and get somebody in that position? That's our second major overall indicator. The third one is onboarding costs. So you can bring in talent of all kinds that are trained in so many different ways, but if they can't perform on the job and it takes you another year to get that person up and running, you just spent a year's worth of wages along with all the time that's been invested, and they may move on. And then we go deeper into 4 other categories, but I'm gonna stop there and you can continue.
Perfect place to jump off of. At Stride Funding, we work with employers to acquire new talent and to retain that talent. Specifically, we do that by helping them to basically offer students pathways to free learning, free upskilling, paying off full-on student loans for degree programs, as well as paying off certifications, short course training programs, et cetera. So literally, we were asking employers to put in cash to pay off some form of education. And so inevitably, some CFO or somebody in their organization is asking, well, before we launch this, even as a pilot, tell me how is this going to work on a P&L basis. And so ROI is absolutely instrumental. We could not sell to one employer in our pipeline or who we currently work with. If it were not for that, I think we saw our sales cycles go from a pretty typical like 6 to 7 month enterprise sales cycle to about a 3-month enterprise sales cycle. Once we implemented, we basically had our eng team build out, don't tell them I said this, a glorified Excel model that we can take to employers to show them what the ROI is on a P&L basis of every dollar they're putting into the programs that we're running with them. And I'd say there's kind of like 3 tiers of, I'll say, advancement that the employers we work with are thinking about when they think about what the return part of that investment looks like. We have some who are just thinking about the cost takeout side. They're thinking about essentially some kind of metric around time to fill. They're thinking about the cost of recruitment or onboarding, and that's about the extent of it. Maybe they are looking at something on the retention side, and they have some measurement that they've already built internally around what the cost of attrition is for them. The next, I'll say, level is somebody who's also thinking about what are the, broadly speaking, the revenue drivers in our organization, and what dollars are we leaving on the table by having unfilled seats if it's a hospital system and they are lacking technicians, or they are lacking people with, technologist certifications so that they can actually run various scans. They're thinking about something on that revenue side of their P&L for where is there opportunities that they are literally not able to fill because they don't have the right talent in the right place, trained with the right certifications. And I should say up front, we do a lot with healthcare, so certifications are a key piece to this. The last one is, or the most advanced, I would say, is in line with what Heather shared. They're thinking about something that is like a core, fundamental, connective business KPI, right? Something like NPS, something like a quality of care score, something that is actually tied to how can we measure who on our floor is actually driving better quality of care, which is the, obviously, NPS equivalent in healthcare. And so when we can work all of those in to that ROI calculator that we're putting in front of a CFO's org at the front end, that's A, helpful for them to see why would they put the dollars out for a program like this. And B, what we do with that is we take that and plug that straight into the dashboard that they're going to see for the lifetime that we work with them to see, well, how are we measuring against what the expectations or assumptions were in that model that got you on board with this program to start with. And so we will literally track against exactly those measurements. They will be different for every org, usually built off the same fundamental building blocks, albeit very different if you move from healthcare to semiconductor to something else. But yeah, 100%, I can't think of a way that we could do our business with it if it wasn't for ROI.
Thank you both. Jay, so for you, you work with employers that are implementing large-scale workforce initiatives. Looking ahead, what do you see as the most important factors in helping employers to really see the tangible return on investment in skills-first efforts?
Sure, thanks, Soumya. So one of the things that I would acknowledge first is this has been a pursuit of many businesses for a long time to think about what the return on their learning investment is. But what we see a lot of organizations doing still is looking at satisfaction with a learning experience, or maybe going into, is there evidence through an assessment that somebody has learned a set of skills? It's increasingly, we're seeing increasingly businesses are focusing on measures beyond that. Are we seeing evidence of behavior change? Are we seeing evidence of true business impact? But those are more elusive and much harder to track. As some evidence of that, some recent survey results showed that 8% of C-suites can see a tangible connection between their investment in learning and a true measurable business impact, where 75% of companies are reporting that they're increasing their investment in learning experiences. And so there's clearly an instinct, a gut feeling that senior executives have that they need to invest more in learning, but the ability to tangibly measure that return is elusive to many. And I would say it's unusual to be able to quote a statistic like the one that you did, Heather, where you have a group of stores that's delivering 23% better NPS than a control group. But we recently wrote an article. I wouldn't call it a thoroughly researched piece, but I would call it a call for examples, and I'd further that call in this forum, which is that we're increasingly seeing a thirst to make a tighter connection. And so if we look back 20 years, an analog would have been return on marketing investment, where you probably have all heard the saying, I know that half of my marketing spend is valuable, I just don't know which half. And so that mindset led to a lot of rich research around how to improve the return and the tangible measurement of return on marketing spend. I would say that it's time now for us to do the same thing with learning, and the piece that we wrote puts forward a new measure called return on learning investment and a call to action around that. And the more examples that we can show, like the one Heather cited, I think the more compelling it will be for people to increase the way that they think strategically about learning. Right now, in most companies, learning, L&D is a cost center, and it's not connected to the P&L mindset of the business directly. And so increasingly, we're trying to have conversations with C-suite executives that are P&L managers alongside the HR team and the learning team, so that we can have a holistic conversation about maybe you need to increase the amount that you're investing in learning because it can actually drive revenue or it can drive a customer care measure. And so we think that it is the drumbeat that's critical for all executives to think about, beyond just the important labor market measures, but what are the true business measures?
Great, thank you. One of the things that we do at Grads of Life is we work directly with employers in helping them in their skills first journey. And one employer that I'm working with, they told us it's great to have all of these statistics. I think one that we've been talking about recently is Burning Glass released a report, I think last month, where they found that when you hire using a skills-based approach, on average, over 2 years, you'll see a 20% higher retention in your skills-based hires. But I think to this employer, their concern was like, that's great, it's a number, but there's also, for us, we need the success stories. And so I'm just curious to get the panel's perspective on how you all kind of think about the balance of having the kind of quantitative metrics, like you shared, Heather, with the kind of qualitative success stories and kind of how that plays out when you're engaging with employers.
I think... So the other part, maybe the less rosy part of the Burning Glass Institute study, is that I think something like 45% of companies were what they called backsliders. So they had talked a large game. They had, in fact, removed degree requirements. And 2 years later, they had seen more as a percentage of mix, student roles filled by people with degrees than without. And so I think we have work to do there. I think my practical view is I won't like opine on what the world should be. What the world is that like we have to deliver it on a dollars basis. Otherwise, you're going to constantly be dragging, the people organization or the talent organization or the workforce organization will be dragging along a CFO or a CEO for the ride. And so we have to prove this out in a way that is in fact data-driven. I love that Heather has that. I also think Walmart has so much scale that like they get to large numbers that can be statistically significant so quickly, and I love that. But we need more examples like that because otherwise we will unfortunately have a lot of the backsliding. So maybe just a little gloomy, but I wanted to at least flag that.
I would just add, so we were referenced in the report as one of the companies that was making good on the promise of skills-based hiring and development. And so I was really interested to talk to Burning Glass while we were here. And we were talking about, what were they tracking and looking at the data. And the hardest thing in terms of ROI or being able to show the stories was around tracking of the career trajectory of people, not just within your company and how they grow, which even for a company like us, which has a lot of data, that's still challenging to, keep track of all the people who have come through those programs and how has their career progressed over the years. But particularly the people who have left the company and gone on to leverage the skills that they've built with us to continue their careers. I think that's a really important one. It's a hard one for organizations to track, but that's where a lot of really great stories come from, is when we have looked into our Live Better You pipeline and the folks that have graduated from that program and looked at how they've progressed into roles of greater responsibility and significantly more economic benefits.
I might just add that I think there's a place for both metrics-based return measures and stories. I think the way that, many of us, find stories as compelling as, empirical evidence. And I would say, the CFO, David, to your point, might want to see, okay, if I'm going to invest $1 million in this program, what's the return I'm going to get on it? But there are a lot of people that, in a sales organization that say, tell me a story of how, based on the learning experience, that I got greater conversion rate, and give me 5 stories of how that upskilling translated into higher conversion rate and more productivity. And those can be just anecdotal. And so I think there's a place for both at this point in our maturity in thinking about return.
And I'd just kind of build on that a little bit. With over 1,000 locations of community and technical colleges just here in the United States, and another about 130 locations in Canada, one of the stories, a little bit different on the qualitative measures, is in some organizations, there's an average, is what we're finding, of about 7 individuals that have to manage the partnerships with all these different locations in order to align their hiring plans with the talent that they need. And that measure to start with was very quantitative. How can we get it from, the average of 7 down to like 2? So that we're not paying that extra 5 in payroll, et cetera, out. What to me was really interesting was that the story really varies depending upon who it is that you're talking to. And so as far as the working learners go, for them what's important is, hey, I got that $55,000 job, and it worked with just a 24-week accelerated program that let me develop the skills that I needed, and I went from a sorter position or a fulfillment position into a maintenance technician position. So I agree, both kinds of stories are qualitative and quantitative indicators are necessary.
Yeah, I think in one of the earlier sessions, there was a great question about frontline managers and how do you support them through the change. And I think it's just getting at what we said, kind of each stakeholder group within an organization and the learners all have kind of differing needs in terms of what's going to kind of compel them to act. Jay, I think one of the things that you mentioned in the prep was talking about the shift from supply side impact to demand side impact. Do you mind expanding on that a bit?
Well, in that context, I would describe it as a labor supply side, right, where it's important to be able to fill critical positions quickly. It's important to be able to qualify somebody for, a promotion or a higher wage level. Those are critical measures on what I would call the labor supply side. On the demand side, it would be, am I driving higher levels of productivity, growth rate, market share gains, innovation, and those measures are often not considered and not put at the forefront. I mean, a lot of our work is helping organizations think about starting with that impact in mind and then constructing scale learning experiences that are intentionally connected to that desired impact, rather than starting with what's on the shelf as a learning experience.
Great. Would anyone want to respond to that?
I don't have anything for that, but I would jump off of something on the prior topic because I think it's important. I also, we have more data than we ever have, and organizations can be data-driven. I do really agree with the idea that both are important. You just can't. I think there's a Bezos concept out there that is if the anecdotes and the stats don't match, then the anecdotes are right. And so we need both. But we also do, organizations have an applicant tracking system for the front end of the funnel. They have an HRIS system. They frequently have some kind of employee engagement tool that's being used for real-time feedback, whether that's homegrown or otherwise. And so we are seeing a number of our partners say, okay, we have a view of what ROI looks like on the front end, and as we want to move up the continuum towards things that are MPS-like or what is a really good specific business outcome, let's plug in to all of these different systems and map to what did we know about the people on the front end when we were hiring them, what did we see about them on a engagement with our benefits, engagement with our L&D, what did we see that we saw on a regular, both annual or semi-annual review cycle, but also what's the feedback and touch points there. And it just feels like we are at a moment where in fact there is more data accessible via kind of open API that if organizations are willing to share that, my guess is with a BCG or somebody, or they have an internal team that can run the analytics, you can find correlations and pull that out for an organization really well. So companies should feel really empowered to do that. It can feel really constraining to be where do I even find this data? And so I would just give everybody a little push there.
Yeah, the last thing I would just add is, depending on where you're sitting in the organization, it's really hard to get the business data potentially that you need to be able to show that ROI. And so I think the most important thing is to start with the business. What are the most critical roles for them to accomplish their strategy today and in the future? What are the skills that they foresee are going to be required to make those roles productive, successful, high-performing? And then you can work into what kind of data does the business have? How can they partner with you? Which is far more powerful than us sitting on the side calculating something and saying, voila, look at what we've done for you, but really partnering with the business, having them participate in the calculation and determination of what the right data to look at is. I think that's one of the most powerful things you can do.
Thanks. Yeah,
I guess what I would add is that I think it's really interesting that a lot of this conversation used to be around the recruiting side of things, how do we recruit, because you could find people wherever they were and figure out how to kind of bring them in because there was enough of a skill set there. The huge change in the landscape of not being able to find people already ready to go makes it even more critical to reverse engineer from demand. Because you don't want all of these people just sitting there that don't have a place to go, which is so different than the traditional education and skills development arena that we've operated in for so long of, hey, find yourself, figure out what you want to do your passion, go after this, go after that. And it's like this imbalance, we have literally created it ourselves. And now we're saying, okay, let's reverse engineer from demand, but we've got to be really careful because that pendulum, one side to the other, I don't think both, one extreme is better than the other. I think we're going to have to find a way to braid this together with the right kind of balance between metrics and stories to ensure that we're getting to the right outcomes for everyone.
Great, thank you. So wanted to open it up to all of you to see if there were any questions. Your hand went up really fast in the back. Go for it.
Hi everyone. I hope I'm loud enough. So thank you. Good insights. I want to ask you kind of double-ended question. One is about who should be driving that investment? Is it business? Is it HR? Is it L&D? Is it somebody else? And if we imagine that they're successful in doing that, what's the size of the pie? How much ROI or how much value we can unlock that?
I mean, as I mentioned a moment ago, I believe you have to start with the business, their strategy, what they're going to need to fuel for the future. And so from that, we can determine what are the skills. And then from the skills, we can say, where do these skills exist in our current associate population, whether it's those same skills or if it's adjacent skills, to understand the size of the population. And then what's the gap to the roles that we ultimately need them to fill. That should drive your L&D strategy into what programs are we going to have? When do we need people to be ready now? The example of that would be with the Live Better You program that we had in Walmart. Originally, it was very degree focused. If you know working adults, it takes many, many years to complete a degree. And in the early period of that, we offered a ton of degrees. It wasn't really curated, right? And so then when you think about the ROI, people were getting those degrees and maybe landing a job in Walmart or maybe getting a degree that didn't apply necessarily in Walmart, going elsewhere. Now with a business-first approach driving the L&D strategy, we've really pivoted the portfolio to include a lot more short-form certs that allow people to get upskilled specifically for the in-demand jobs that are going to help them with the mobility within the company. And so that's where I would just say you have to focus there first. And then the ROI we've talked about for our business, but others might want to add.
Yeah, I agree with that. I might just, to your last question, if I think about the global education spend, it's about 5% of global GDP, and almost all of that occurs pre-employment, right? And so if you imagine that with the way that the world is going, that lifelong learning and career pivots are much more the norm, then what we learn early in life is insufficient, right, to fuel us through our careers. And so we as a society have to increase our investment in lifelong education and reskilling. How much is that? I mean, it could be a couple more points of GDP, I think, easily on a global basis. So it's a huge TAM, and I think the more that we can talk about the return that accrues to business, to society, to individuals, the more we can defend that increased spend.
Great, thank you. Oh, so were you going to respond? Or?
I was just going to respond to one part of your question. The part that I was going to respond to is it L&D or where do you come from? Once you have that business impact and you understand that, before you jump into what it is that you need to upskill, reskill, or recruit, or whatever, here's what we found is 3 parts working in tandem seem to have the best result. One is the actual operational side, the people who are on the line having to do the technical training to keep operations moving. Second is L&D, because they're kind of overall looking here and trying to connect all the dots. And then the third is the recruiting side. And they all seem to sit at different places within organizations, but once those three start operating together, it seems like the business impact is much more ensured.
Thank you. I think there was a question back there. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. This was one of my favorite panels of the entire.
Oh, we won. I love it. I'm so happy.
My question is really about population level data and place. So when you're talking about differences across different stores, one of the things that came to my mind, being from a more rural part of the country, is, are there breakdowns urban versus rural, for example? Is there demographic layers? And then from an equity perspective, equity data, geographic, demographic equity in broad terms, how does that play into your thinking about ROI?
I mean, in general, just speaking about how we look at our facilities against one another, we do look at like facilities in terms of, revenue, complexity, urban versus rural. So we control for those variables and compare like to like as much as possible, right? When we think about the opportunity that we're trying to provide for our associates, you probably heard the statistics if you went to some of the other sessions that 90% of the American population has a Walmart within 10 miles of them. So when you think about whether it's our DCs or our fulfillment centers or our stores, Walmart really does represent a cross-section of America. And the opportunity that we provide is for all of those associates, regardless of where they are. But the path that they take will look different depending on their situation, right? So if I'm in an FC that's out on its own, on an interstate without a lot of other employers around, then what will that path look like depends on my mobility, my motivations, my personal interests. And we find that that's the part that a lot of times in the skills conversations we don't talk about as much. We call it the plus part. So we talk about skills in terms of skills plus, the motivations, interests, and traits being that piece. I find as we get further and further into our journey, that part actually matters almost more than anything else in terms of helping people find the right opportunity for them and to be successful and fulfilled in their career with Walmart. So I would encourage companies to not necessarily just think about like the traditional demographics, but to look at the groups that they're trying to support with skills through that lens of motivations, traits, interests, and mobility.
Yeah, and I would just say I think that's a really great point. In one of the earlier panels that came up as well too is, just because a company is moving to skills-based hiring, that doesn't automatically mean you're going to get a more diverse population, right? And so really needing to think about the equity and inclusion in not just removing the degree, but thinking about the hiring practices, how you're supporting managers and talent acquisition and doing this work. So thank you. I think we might have time for one short question. Yep, go ahead.
How does the pitch for skills plus based hiring differ between, if you're talking to a company who's really feeling a very clear bottleneck is unavoidable, it's affecting clear bottom line versus others which maybe have more margins, they're experiencing more of a talent glut in their key positions than a talent shortage. Is there still a case to be made for ROI for folks who aren't feeling an immediate and painful squeeze?
I mean, I'll take a crack. I mean, first of all, I'm not sure that there are very many companies that would admit to feeling a talent glut right now, and particularly in digital and data and AI-oriented roles. Those would be pretty rare, and based on my experience. I think it would be harder to defend, right, or an ROI if you found yourself in that situation than somebody that felt constrained from a human capital perspective. What I think is closer to the reality is something Parminder mentioned is that there's really a labor market failure right now because the key roles that most companies are trying to fill that they see as having a lot of economic leverage. The talent pools are not forthcoming in today's market from just going out and hiring. And even if you do, you're going to pay a premium for that. And so most organizations that we're seeing are much more inclined to invest behind their existing employees for a lot of reasons. But one of those is it's really hard to find that talent in the market.
I guess just if I could throw in one last quick point that is adjacent at best, but I think is important, is one of the things that we don't ever talk about when we talk about ROI is the ROI, and I think Heather alluded to it, but the ROI to the individual. And if it's not tied to business outcomes, beyond that you might lose sponsorship at the enterprise level, that individual senses that. They know that. And so like the dirty secret around the just the degree side of upskilling is that in many of these large employers and many of the providers, the graduation rates are like single digit, right? And there's a reason for that. That is logical. If your direct manager, your business unit is not imploring you that this is essential to the step up. And that's the same when you go from degree to skills-based, right? That person still needs to see what is in it for me. Otherwise, I'm not going to engage with it. And so I think we should also think about the ROI from that side of things, which is probably a whole separate panel somewhere in this great conference. But yeah.
And I would just add that this is where I think that partnership with operations is crucial, because a lot of it ends up happening in HR or HR-related functions, but when you get to job performance outcomes, then it doesn't matter if it's a degree or if it's a boot camp or whatever the way that you got the stuff that you needed to be successful. It's really about that relationship between what you have and what you can perform, how you can perform. And that's what I think makes the case in places where there's not an immediate need.
Well, thank you, everyone, for your engagement. Thank you, panelists. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their ASU+GSV experience. So